All right, we are on. Okay. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. And today is the first of our TEAS lecture series. I know we have, you heard one of the lectures in our last class, which was on Nazrul. That is part of a bigger agenda. The three lectures that will follow starting from today is tied directly, as you can understand from the readings that were assigned, to our course syllabi. Okay. Today's session in particular is one of the favorite, which I really looked forward to organizing and thankfully ultimately succeeded. I present to you Dr. Gabriella Pishotti. A little bit about herself she'll introduce though, but she and I went to WVU, and during my PhD journey, most of the time my life was being jealous of her, okay? Because she was the smartest in the cohort with everything, the pro style and everything. I learned from a lot from her, and she was a huge inspiration even as a cohort member in my journey as well. Her dissertation was fascinating, and she is one of the few scholars. Remember when I give you the assignment and I asked you, like, apart from the content, you also have to understand how to present the information, okay? The structure, because that communication is half the key, especially with all of us having different measure and we living in an interconnected world. Part of the struggle is making sure that you demonstrate your expertise in a way that also appeals to the audience and reels them in understand your opinion. And that is also a very necessary quality, especially in this particular time. We all understand what has been the result of the election, and depending on which side you are on, it is good, bad, but both of it. But it shows the power of rhetoric and communication that I constantly argue, like what exactly we tell and how we do so. Dr. Pishori is a master of that front, especially on the writing, and she's one of the few scholars that I know who's, when I shared her writing and stuff, you have read most of the pieces that I've shared in the class, and some of them are very, very dry. And that is part of my job to read that, but not part of your job always. And nobody reads that for fun. Okay. But her stuff specifically, right, the readings that she assigned is have that emotive appeal per se, which is a very difficult thing to do for academic writing. And you will see from the presentation itself, which is also fascinating. So without much ado, okay, Dr. Pishotti, okay, the floor is yours. Please take on, and I'll come back again once you're done with the presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction. I do hope that I can live up to it today. I'm very excited about what we'll be chatting about. But just some quick background information about myself. I specialized during my doctorate studies in immigration and refugee studies. Talked with Dr. Raman quite a bit about this topic. And so this is my specialty area, and I'm very, very excited and honored to join this lecture series to be a part of this conversation. My current position, I'm coming to you from Pittsburgh today, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I currently work for the Pittsburgh Foundation, which is a community philanthropy. And in that role, I do education for our offices as part of their diversity, equity, and inclusion team. So I'm very excited that I get to take a lot of what I worked on during my doctoral studies and apply it to the very practical work that we're doing at my community foundation. So that's a very short bit of background about myself. But I'm going to dive in today and get us ready for this talk. If there's anything that I mentioned today or that comes up that you want further clarification on, please feel free to ask it during the Q&A later on, or I'll pass along my email to Dr. Rahman, and you're also very welcome to email me with any follow-up questions as well. But again, thank you for inviting me to be part of the TEAS Project Lecture Series. And I'm excited to think about the powerful lens today that literature can offer to the field of critical refugee studies, which you've been working on and diving into all throughout this semester. But before I began my presentation, I did want to start today with a land acknowledgement. This land acknowledgement helps to remind us of the people who have been harmed and oppressed in the past and of the harms that continue today. And so through this Indigenous land acknowledgement, I wanted to recognize Pittsburgh, which is, again, the city I'm presenting from. It occupies the ancestral lands of the Seneca, the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Mahagahila peoples, who were later joined by other refugees from other tribes, including the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Mingo, who were all forced off their original land and displaced by European colonists. I also want to acknowledge that Hartford, where all of you are tuning in from today, it occupies the territory of the Eastern Pequot, the Golden Hill Pawcasket, the Lenape, the Mashatauket Pequot, the Mohegan, the Nipmuc, and the Schaghticoke peoples who have stewarded that land throughout generations. I want us to collectively acknowledge the native lands, languages, and cultures that have been severely damaged or lost due to forced removal or assimilation. And I want us to honor the original caretakers of these regions and uplift their historic, unique, and enduring relationship with this land. So that I ask today that we aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. So thank you for that. And then I will get my presentation started and we'll jump on into things. All right. So typically, my talk today is going to look at how refugee writers can provide representations of the subjective and emotional experiences of people who are undergoing survival migration in a way that statistics and the non-literary accounts that you've perhaps been reading throughout the semester, they leave out or just don't have the space to include. And so it's important to remember that migration, this is something we oftentimes forget about it, but migration is bound up with emotion, and giving value to this emotion is key to fostering an understanding of what refugees have faced and are continuing to face in the present day. Creative refugee texts help to provide complex portrayals of the migrant figure and raise questions such as how does refugee literature and artwork capture complex material and emotional experiences of refugees, and how do they do so in a way that challenges our global imagination to conceive refugee peoples and voices as having agency rather than as simply despairing or being a silent victim. So to give a quick overview of my talk today, I'm planning to start with what will hopefully be a convincing argument about why literature and creative works are so vital to this conversation about critical refugee studies. I'll then move us into examining how literature can build a bridge between text and reader. And then we'll look at some concrete examples of refugee poetry and art that embody refugee memory work. And then I'll finally close out with a discussion of survivance. I'll explain what that is and how this very traditionally Native American framework can very aptly be applied to creative refugee works as well. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Think for a minute, when you think about refugee literature, what is it that comes to mind? It's going to be a quick second for you to think about it and reflect on it. Okay. So when we're tracing the evolution of refugee literature, we have a variety of texts that we can talk about. You have post-World War II refugee writers like Elie Wiesel and Rothia Halo, who were shepherds of this field and wrote to accrue awareness or compassion or sympathy for the journeys and the hardships that they endured. This then led into modern day writers like Viet Thanh Nguyen, Ocean Vuong, and Fatima Asghar, where their focus is more on using literature as a form of political critique. You've got those who write about refugees but are not refugees themselves, such as Aravind Adiga or Mohsin Hamid. And then you have those who are children or descendants of refugees who are very close to the subject but may not be refugees themselves, such as Christy Leftieri, or as we're going to read today, Theresa has a very similar relationship to that as well. And then you also have refugee literature that's autobiographical, like Clementine Marmaria's The Girl Who Smelled Beans, and also refugee works that take place in fantastical worlds that are almost more fantasy-leaning and realistic, such as Helen Oyeyemi's Gingerbread. So on one hand, these different distinctions of the different types of refugee works are important, but on the other, collectively, these writers and their different works make up the field of what we would label as refugee literature, which is an ever-growing and an ever-evolving field that I believe, especially as refugees continue to increase in number, will continue to become even more distinct and robust and will evolve in ways that we probably can't even forecast. And so while refugee literature shares many overlaps with what we would consider immigration or multi-ethnic literature, it does differ in terms of the subject's positionality within these works. So immigration or multi-ethnic literature is oftentimes focused on the transition between two nation states, while refugee literature operates from a position of separation or exclusion. Viet Thanh Nguyen suggests, quote, what the immigrant story supposedly registers is the difficult but ultimately rewarding struggle to become American. It's a transformation from wretchedness to righteousness, from victimization to voice, end quote. In contrast, however, the refugee story is often shaped by a disrupted sort of temporality and an inability to transform into citizens. The refugee subject often remains indefinitely within a position of political and geographic vulnerability, in which their situation is almost always temporary and incomplete. So rather than focus on growth, or traditionally, as you may have heard, like a hero's journey sort of plotline, refugee texts actually often focus on themes of arrested development or the loss of self and how the asylum seeking process can exacerbate both. So it's almost diametrically opposed to immigration literature, which I think makes it really interesting because a lot of times the two are clumped together. So with this context, why is refugee literature important? In our country today, various politicians and media often refer to refugees and migrants as, quote, populations of waste or floods or tides of people. And describing refugees in these ways characterizes them as forces to be protected against, rather than as a group of people in dire need. We saw a lot of this rhetoric, especially surrounding the recent election. What this rhetoric reflects is it contributes to negative public attitudes directed towards refugees and migrant peoples by erasing sort of their own individual hardships and conflicts, and it ignores the humanitarian situation that their situation is actually exposing. For years, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees released a weekly summary called the Refugee Brief, which was a short overview of major refugee news headlines that occurred the previous week. It was discontinued in mid-2022, but up until that point, it consistently reported a rising death toll, specifically in the Mediterranean, as more and more migrants were dying in attempts to cross the sea, and as dangerous and poor conditions in refugee camps continued to be ignored. And so what these reports revealed is that despite research, this is from 2019, so it is a little outdated. I'm curious as to what would be a 2024 report, but in 2019, the research showed that global attitudes towards refugees have become more accepting. However, despite that, the refugee crisis only continued to worsen, and a lot of policies and laws in the surrounding areas of the Mediterranean continue to become stricter against helping and aiding of refugee peoples. But this fact is really easy to ignore if you're not a witness to the crisis firsthand and are only able to conceive those who are involved in it as statistics and numbers rather than as individual people. And this isn't a critique on us individually. This is how our brains work, is when we see something so often in the news or the way that it's reported, it sort of is a way we detach it from the way that we interact with individual people. And so the plight of the refugee entails more than just a journey to safety because of this. They also oftentimes have to endure the loss of family, the precarity of refugee camps, painstaking or traumatic asylum process, and that's if they're lucky enough to be able to be granted one. And ultimately, this leads into an unknowable future. So many humanitarian projects exist across the globe to assist refugees, but they're oftentimes forced to reckon with a number of ethical complexities. So for example, in The Predicament of Humanitarianism by Dictee argues that humanitarianism only arises from a public perception of suffering or the need for aid. He explains that, quote, images of disasters, famines, and wars of aid organizations and relief operations have become familiar to us. They form the moral and emotional landscape of the age of humanitarianism in which we live. So these images come to convey the narrative that we use to understand what a humanitarian crisis looks like. And over the decades, as media has become even more instantaneous and widely available, the collection of images that have come to capture events have formed a larger narrative about what humanitarian aid should look like and upon whom it should be bestowed. And so it's helped to set up certain understandings of how we perceive what humanitarianism is and what it looks like. The problem with visually driven humanitarianism, and this is completely setting aside the problem of information fatigue or compassion fatigue, but the other problem is that it acknowledges a suffering body oftentimes rather than a suffering person. And so the label of victim in these cases can erase a person's subjectivity as well as their agency within the situation. Suffering is oftentimes thought about as physical. It's our need for food, our need for water, our need for shelter, and these are all certainly very, very necessary to address. But refugees also need to be recognized more than just as passive bodies, and also as people with complex emotional interiorities that are capable of their own agency. And in fact, they're constantly acting upon it to move forward as a refugee, to get to from one spot to another requires a lot of agency. And so this, I argue, is where literature and other creative works can serve as very powerful interventions into this conversation. And so literature as a medium, I'm not sure how many English majors are in this class, but literature as a medium is designed to build connections between a text and a reader through aesthetic representation. And because these connections can never be direct, you can't shake hands with a character in a book, we might think about them more as vibrations of relationality that happen through resonance. So we feel a connection with the reader, but we can't physically interact with them. The potential of these vibrations derives from quick moments of connection that come from reading. And Tegan Bradley analyzes this relationality in her work. She calls it, quote, a social encounter engendered by the text, end quote. So today what we're going to look at is how creative representations of refugee experiences can impact and cultivate this type of relationality or this vibration between reader and text. And so this happens, or one way this happens, is through what David Palumbo refers to as the literary delivery system. It's like a little mail truck between delivering feelings between a book and a reader. And what it does is it creates a space for imagining our relation to others and thinking through why and how that relation exists, both historically, politically, and ideologically. So narratives break down the separation between ourselves and the others by immersing readers into a story's character and into the world. We experience this every time we get sucked into a book and we feel like we're in the world that we're reading. In the case of contemporary refugee texts, this means that rather than be representative of a universal experience, these works are offering various possibilities of experience, and this is very important. One refugee may live in a refugee camp, another may not. One may be waiting years to reunite with a family, and another may never have that opportunity. And so too often in the media, the refugee figure is discussed as a universally understood subject. We hear the word refugee and we immediately have sort of an image come to mind. That's oftentimes built through stereotypical images of migration or border crossing. But because of this, the refugee figure runs the risk of becoming nothing more than a metaphor. As a metaphor, the refugee figure neatly wraps the complexity of the refugee experience into a single character or person. And in doing so, this erases the people that it's meant to represent, and it also resists complex engagement. And so the need to detach refugee texts from this metaphor of the refugee figure is why literature and art can offer very crucial representations. Refugee creators are able to present a multitude of refugee characters, worlds, and experiences, and these different depictions show how the insufficiency of the metaphor of the refugee figure and allow not only for complexity, but also a clashing of different experiences that may even contradict or argue or even oppose one another. So take, for instance, the examples that I have here are Fox Girl and Comfort Woman, which are two novels written by Nora Akjak-Keller. Both works focus on the lives of Korean refugee women who were forced to serve as comfort women two soldiers following the Korean War, yet both women are distinctly different characters who end up living very vastly different lives. And so I think this is a great illustrative example of how no refugee story is the same, just like no human experience is ever the same. And while this may seem very obvious to us, making that distinction is a key piece to recognizing refugee agency, as well as restoring humanity to what otherwise remains of a metaphorical or stereotypical refugee future. Take a quick water break here. All right. So now that we've worked through the what and the why of refugee literature, I want to jump into the how and look at some examples of how refugee literature can lean into the creative and the aesthetic elements in order to offer a dynamic representation of refugee experiences, where we're going to get into our close readings to illustrate the ways in which literature is actually functioning in a way that is offering these different types of representations. So for the sake of this presentation, I've chosen for us to look at Theresa Chaz's semi-autoethnographic work, Dictee, which is part memoir, part poetry, part multimedia project. I know that I sent along a handful of pages that I hope you enjoyed getting a chance to look at. And what you may have noticed, or what's especially notable about this book, is that its writing is purposely fragmented and it's on purpose difficult to read. It's one of those books that when it gets assigned, you're like, oh, the teacher just wants to watch me suffer. And it's like, no, that is the purpose of the book, is that it is supposed to be difficult to read. Not so much in a content sense, even though the content of the book is very heavy, but rather in a comprehension sense. And this is because it's supposed to reflect the difficulty of language learning as a Korean refugee and the struggle to reclaim one's own voice and identity. And so the process of reading the book is actually illustrative of the struggle that Cha herself went through. So Dictee focuses not only on the life of Cha and her mother, but also on the lives of a variety of women who were both revolutionaries and martyrs. It's a collage of fragmented text and images, and it pieces together the stories of each woman's suffering and sacrifice, creating sort of an ultimate narrative about women's endurance and resistance against nation's oppression, while also meditating on how such stories can be told and the different ways that they can impact readers. It's a very short summary of Dictee that does not do it justice. But Dictee, which in French translates to dictation, begins with a series of dictation and translation exercises that introduce the book's meditation on language and its limitations and capacity for violence. And these were the excerpts that I had you look at. And so the book switches between English and French, with some Korean, Latin, and Japanese interspersed throughout. And this is meant to represent Cha's connection to the post-colonial Japanese, French, and American education systems, and how they both formed and fragmented her language identity as she was growing up. So examining this multilingual focus within Dictee, Stella O analyzes, quote, that within the colonial framework, dictation, a linguistic exercise, functioned as a political tool to bolster a broader colonial agenda. Language, especially in the colonial education system, helped to foster a form of psychic colonization in the minds of the colonized, end quote. And so the dictation exercises that are presented to us in Dictee convey this type of systematic re-education where the sentences themselves are repetitively bland, but they're constructed to teach certain ways of thinking that are meant to strip the speaker parts of their individuality or their identity. So for example, this is on page 8. The narrator is instructed to write in French sentences such as, quote, if you did not speak so quickly, they would understand you better. Be industrious. The more one works, the better one succeeds. And go away more quietly next time. Unquote. The practice of writing these sentences is tedious, but the content of the sentences themselves is also dangerous. Both of these feelings are simultaneously existing at the same time, and viewing the text with a sort of conflicting tension that's meant to capture the experiences of refugees, immigrants, and other language learners. Specifically, Cha chooses to have these sentences represent the language exercises she performed as a girl to convey how colonial education systems interweave language learning with psychic colonization to assimilate refugees and immigrants so they become quiet yet productive members of their new country. So there's multiple layers to what's going on in this language learning exercise. In Dictee, Cha connects the ritualistic nature of dictations, the repetition of repeating something over and over or writing something over and over again, with the ritualistic nature of religion. And she finds that in both, there is this praise or this championing of silence. She writes, quote, "She herself would be sinless, pure, and chaste of heart. She would be silent, often, most of the time, most often than not, far too often," end quote. So by blending dictation with religion and silence with morality, the narrator is forced into a place of silence that she comes to lament. And while the narrator is unhappy with this silence, she finds it very difficult to break. And so Lisa Lowe, in her analysis of Dictee, explains that through Dictee, the processes of coming to speech in the imposed languages of French, Japanese, or English are thematized as simultaneously a forced fluency that obliterates and silences differences, and the instrumental means of voicing an oppositional utterance. So although seemingly this is a practice in expanding communication of learning a new language, Cha is showing how this form of forced fluency is actually a practice in silencing, because it's systematically separating migrant individuals from their mother tongue in a culture in an attempt to rid them of difference. They want that mother tongue to go away completely. So it's not an exercise in learning an additional language, it's replacing one language with another. In Dictee, Cha's examination of her experience with dictation suggests that it's a tool for erasing cultural identity. However, by replicating this formal model of language learning in Dictee, Cha reveals that her fragmented voice, while simultaneously using that fragmentation to resist being silenced and find her own form of utterance. So she's almost reclaiming the fragmentation. And she uses this style of writing to capture a sense of lost voice and the struggle to make meaning. So one of the opening passages of the work, and this is on page 5, even reads, "From the thickness, from weighted motion upwards, slowed to deliberation, even when it passed upward and through her mouth again, the delivery, she takes it, slow, the invoking, all the time now, all the time there is, always and all times, the pause, uttering, hers now, hers there, the other." So consisting of a series of repetitive sentence fragments, this passage conveys the struggle of the narrator to say even a single word. And I think this passage is really illustrative of Dictee as a whole. This small articulation, the utter that she talks about, is a result of constantly wading through the thickness, which is an aesthetic experience that's being emulated in this passage, so that readers are similarly pushing through the thick, muddied language of these half-thoughts and fragments. Dominika Ferenc, in her analysis of Dictee, talks about how fracture isn't just an aesthetic tool that's being used, but it's actually the key theme within Dictee, and is what helps to sort of piece the entire book together. The repetitions and fragmented lines demonstrate the tedious of dictation, and this becomes reflected in the discipline needed as a reader of the text. So again, if the entire text is assigned to you, this isn't something you can usually read in a night. It takes some time to get through because of the way that it's written. The experience that Cha is conveying is one of very high emotion and conflict, but it's also a struggle, or it takes time and commitment to get to that. And so both of these, when they're paired together, leads to a space of halted speech. The book's progression from tedious language exercises to fragmented stories of violence is not a switch from the boring to the shocking, but rather it's a continuous narrative that conveys a persistent violence that's occurring even in the monotonous parts of language learning or in the monotonous parts of Dictee. This dense language is meant to represent or to help the reader understand what it feels like to be in a space where there's just no comprehension that's taking place. It's symbolic of the, quote, impossibility of piecing together a coherent story about the lives of Koreans repeatedly disrupted by European and Japanese imperialism, civil war, and the Cold War that severed Korea in two, leading to the displacement of large populations. And that's end quote, and that's from Dominika Ferenc again. So having been born in Korea during the Korean War, Cha's identity as a refugee and eventually a Korean American immigrant is embedded with violence and trauma that's inescapable, and thus it's infused in Dictee's construction as a semi-autobiographical text. As discussed earlier, a key theme of Cha's work is this arrested development, and she prevents the book from allowing the narrator to progress forward and convey a sense of growth. One example of this can be found in Cha's letter to her mother on April 19th. Cha writes the date 4 times in 4 different ways before beginning her letter, and this repetition conveys not only a delay in thought, but also the sense of becoming stuck in time or stuck in a particular moment. So it's April 19th again and again and again, or that's the feeling that she's conveying. This feeling of being stuck is even more emphasized when Cha follows it up by writing, quote, "Nothing has changed. We are at a standstill. Our destination is fixed on the perpetual motion of search, fixed in its perpetual exile," end quote. So despite time passing, Cha's unable to move forward because she's still stuck in the past violence that continues to pervade her and her mother's life. She conveys this feeling by becoming stuck within the book's language, which then pulls the reader into sort of the quicksand that is this book, and gets them mired in the language as well. And this is what makes the book's experimental form not only a creative choice, but it's incredibly tied to the theme of the work. So although Dictee might be considered a trauma narrative that conveys the violence and silences of Cha's life, its existence as a text is an act of resistance, and it's a return to voice for Cha as well. Her choice to put to paper what she and her family experienced actively pushes back against the silencing that she faced as a refugee, as a student, as a woman in exile. And even though much of Dictee is a search to understand both suffering and Cha's own identity, it's the act of writing itself that's most important for this text. And this comes through clearest with Cha's focus on the materiality of language. So as Hertha Wong explains in her book Picturing Identity, in Dictee, Cha is presenting language or speech as a kind of mediation. She's meditating on how speech is functioning. And she's doing this by emphasizing the physicality of language, and providing detailed descriptions of characters who are speaking or who are attempting to speak. And she does this by complementing it with charts that map the physical formation of language in the throat, on the tongue, and on the lips. And so here is an example of one such instance. This is probably one of my favorite pages in the book because of the way the chart is complementing the language that's on the other side of it. And these charts of the lungs, the larynx, and the vocal folds that Wong is referring to is then paired with a poem that reads, "Cracked tongue, broken tongue, pigeon, semblance of speech, swallows, inhales, stutter, starts, stops before starts, about to, then stops, exhale, swallowed to a sudden arrest." Descriptions such as cracked tongue or broken tongue convey a fractured voice and the pain of damage to that voice. And this poem's focus on individual body parts positioned beside the speech charts forces the reader to consider the physical nature of speech and how it's produced by breath, by muscle, by movement. One of my favorite things to do when reading this is to feel my throat, to feel the breath that I'm taking while I'm doing this. And so in this way, the body that is reading the text and the text itself are not separated. Instead, the varying sentence structure that's happening here allows the reader to pay attention to the materiality of the language by breaking down the boundary between linguistic on the page text and the body that is producing the sound of the text. And so again, these are happening simultaneously, and it's a way of pulling the reader into her experience as well. The switch between the different types of text not only contributes to the book's theme of struggling to find one's language or true voice, but it also serves as a reminder that there is a hand or a person creating the writing. And this is also seen through the switch within Dictee between typed text, between messy handwriting, between some calligraphy. She's constantly experimenting with the style in which she's presenting like the materiality of the text herself. And that's there to sort of keep us thinking about the person that's making the text behind it. So Dictee begins as a search for meaning, but through its continuous struggle with language, it becomes a search for not only voice, but also towards the end, it starts becoming a search for someone to listen. And this is the type of listening, kind of continuing on with this thought, that's best felt through the body. By transferring meaning through the body, this allows the reader to give up his or her own sense of separateness from the text. And so, harking back to Columbo Liu's literary delivery system, this is one of those aesthetic choices that helps to bring a reader, connect the reader and create resonance between a text and themselves. And Chow's work does this through its form and style. And so I want to turn to the final poem in Dictee that's all about this idea of listening through the body. It reads, "Words cast each by each to weather, avowed indisputably to time, if it should impress, make fossil trace of word, residue of word, stand as a ruin stands, simply as mark, having relinquished itself to time, to distance." So because Chow recognizes that readers will not be able to understand her experiences from like a first-hand account, instead she ends her work by instead desiring it to simply leave an imprint upon them. So rather than truth, she just wants to leave an impression. And like a fossil trace, she wants that residue of her words to exist upon the reader themselves as memories of feeling, which she believes can then account for a truer account of her story to survive through time and distance. So I'm going to shift here from focusing on literature as a way to build connection and recover perspectives that otherwise would have been lost, and instead move into exploring how it's also vital for refugee memory work, which I know is a topic that you're all discussing in this class as well. And so this happens within Dictee, of course, but I want us to turn towards Anita Yu Ali's performance narrative, Palimpsest for Generation 1.5, which examines the weight of lost voices within a singular present. So I'm going to set up the video really fast. And then I'm going to just play this while I'm speaking about it. There's no sound or anything, so it should, it's just something for you to take in while I'm talking about the piece. Okay, so in the performance of Palimpsest for Generation 1.5, words and phrases related to Ali's family history as survivors of the Khmer Rouge regime and then as Cambodian refugees are painted across Ali's back, and then subsequently they're washed away, as you'll see here in a moment. This process is repeated over 20 different times, and some of the phrases that are painted include "Nixon orders bombings," "90% of artists are killed," and "Father's PTSD panic attacks." Like Dictee, the monotony of the ritual, coupled with the shock of the phrases that are written across Ali's back, create a space of dissonance where the tedious process of making language, or in this case, painting language, is a focal point. More specifically, this performance's production represents the struggle to put violence and memory into words while attesting to the continued presentness of such history and the loss within upon the body. So in this art performance of Palimpsest for Generation 1.5, the disappearance of language is both visceral and visual. It's a performance that's rooted in the body of Ali herself, echoing the work of Dictee and the connections it draws between the materiality of the body, think those vocal cords, the throat, etc., and the materiality of language itself. So every aspect of Ali's performance emphasizes a different element of her body. Her back serves the canvas for the words, but it's a living canvas that's emphasized by the rhythmic rise and fall of Ali's breaths. Furthermore, Ali's choice to keep her face hidden under a cascading head of hair that defies gravity makes the performance haunting by creating a faceless image that defies the natural order of things. The visuality of the performance symbolizes a reordered sense of temporality in which time or space are not functioning as normal. And when you see her hair the way it's rising up, it makes it feel like something's off or unnatural. Instead, while the words are written and erased repeatedly, it's as if Ali herself is a body that's stuck in time. And as the performance continues, Ali's cascading hair also serves as a mirror reflection to the ink stains that accumulate on the material of her dress, which visually centers attention on her back and consequently the words that are being written and erased. And so once the performance finishes, Ali then detaches herself from the hair in her garment, as she's doing right now, and she explains, quote, "When the gestures end and the body leaves the installation, detached roots, a disembodied dress, and faint traces of a performed history remain. The work examines the cultural and emotional resonance of place and memory in relationship to personal histories of violence." End quote. The remains of the performance operate in a similar vein as the residue of word that Cha seeks to leave behind in Dictee. Both are seeking to convey how memory persists, even when only traces of it are left behind. And so as Kathleen Schlein-Biles explains in her analysis of this performance, it's suggestive of a tablet upon which earlier writing has been erased. A palimpsest likewise underscores a beneath the surface layering of the past that remains, notwithstanding close proximity, covered. And so the performance's focus on the palimpsest of Ali's back is symbolic of historical erasure, while simultaneously emphasizing the traces of lost voices and memories that continue to remain through her. And so while this performance is silent, it is intricately bound to the body's relationship with language and suggests that even while language itself might be erased or not present, the voices of those lost in the memories themselves continue to reside in and upon the body of whether it be family members, whether it be generations later, etc. Okay, so let's return back to the presentation here. Kathleen Schlein-Biles connects the intergenerational experiences that Ali's performance attempts to capture with the concept of rememory. And this is where we dive more into memory work directly. And rememory is a term that's explored and talked about specifically by Brenda Marshall. And she describes rememory as a present absence, a remembered absence, not a void. And this can seem oxymoronic, so stick with me here. But rememory functions as a practice of reclamation, where one who is seeking to restore something that was almost entirely lost. There's only small bits of it left to use to create a fuller memory around. And the process of rememory not only calls upon history, but also contains an acknowledgement of its own imaginative role in rereading, reimagining, or putting back together the collective memory. So it's trying to take that small bit that's left and using imagination and creativity to fill in the larger picture. There are a number of refugee works who do this type of work, but I think Cha and Ali's are really representative of this. And this is because both Cha and Ali are drawing attention to and lament the remembered absences and silences that have never truly disappeared for them, but instead they continue to persist both culturally and generationally. And so while they make sense of these broken histories they're trying to make whole, Ali and Cha also simultaneously reflect on this process of creating work from missing memory and how the rememory aspects of their projects characterizes them actually more as anti-narratives rather than narratives themselves. And this emphasis on being anti-narratives not only insists on both works' focus on reconstructing absence, but it's also the resistance to dominant narratives, which are the reason for such absences in the first place. So think about history, how history oftentimes has, as it's taught in school, there's oftentimes large gaps. History is always told from the perspective of the victor. And so this is leaning into that, this idea of where are the gaps in this history and how can we fill those back in. And so as seen through Ali and Cha, rememory work blends reflection with creation in order to piece back together near forgotten history. The refugee stories emerge not from the words themselves, but rather from the aesthetic experience of reading and watching, and how that comes to resonate within one's own body and speak across time and places of difference. So Cha and Ali's works, while representative of the dynamic ways that refugee literature can create powerful intersections between the aesthetic and the political, the really great representations of this, are largely laments, as we've talked about. And so as I begin closing out my part today, I wanted to end by moving from lament into joy and celebration, which are vital components of refugee experience, and that remind us that while survival may be the immediate goal for refugees, what most seek is a refuge that will allow them to live a livable and joyful life. And so to make this shift from lament into joy, I'm turning to Jared Weisner's work on the concept of survivance. Survivance, if you're not familiar, is a concept that's used in Native American studies that refers to an active or ongoing form of survival um, that directly opposes the state of being categorized as a victim. So according to Weisner, the nature of survivance creates a sense of narrative resistance to absence, literary tragedy, loyalty, and victory. Native survivance is an active sense of presence over historical absence. So again, talking about presences and absences here. And it's a continuation of stories. So while I definitely do not want to conflate the Native American experience with the refugee experience, the basis of survivance as a concept serves as an effective model for refugee texts that also seek to establish presence and rise above tragedy. The rise of refugee literature over the last century attests to this desire for a continuance of stories that both preserve and recreate the refugee presence within the field of global literature. The existence of refugee texts opposes the negative, metaphoric rhetoric used against refugees in the media, the narrative restrictions of asylum hearings, and many other mechanisms of silencing that occur throughout the refugee journey. And so survivance is the ongoing production of texts that showcase or can showcase the dynamic identities of refugees and help to eliminate their voice. And this work is vital to reinforcing the presence of refugees who are often abandoned or hidden away in refugee camps or turned away completely at borders. And so, and then furthermore, survivance work can often serve for refugees as a tool of self-empowerment and healing. And as we've been talking about with our analysis of Cha and then with Ali's work, is what's really great is that survivance work challenges people to put an emphasis on the importance of bodily experience, as we've been doing today, over words and doctrines. And so like refugee literature, survivance is not concerned with creating stories that speak a uniform truth or create a metaphor, but instead assert endurance and presence in a world that is constantly fighting back against both. So to conclude today then, I'm going to turn to an example of survivance work that celebrates refugee identity and futurity through a diverse collection of family retellings. And this is Illuminated Recipes, Cravings, Customs, and Comforts by Christine Yen Tran Fan, which also had you look at before today, and I hope that you enjoyed. So Illuminated Recipes is a project directed by Tran Phan that combines oral history work with mixed media art in order to create a Vietnamese American recipe collection, which I think is really great. The importance of this project being a recipe book is that food is often viscerally associated with memories, places, and traditions, as well as personal and collective history. So food tells stories. It has a who, a where, and a why. And for refugees, it can be a source of solace or a survival necessity. And this comes from Tran Phan herself in the introduction. So while food is crucial to survival, it's also an object of relationality. The taste, smell, and texture of food, as well as the processes of preparing it, are capable of transferring memory and culture across time and place. So think about maybe a food that you have in your family that's a tradition that you pass down, or maybe you make once a year at a special occasion. That it's a food, but within it, it contains so much of like your family, your culture, your own personal identity within it. And so that's how food can be very powerful. And according to Tran Phan, quote, Illuminated Recipes is a project that uses the power of food and art to document the refugee experience, to foster conversation, and to connect people across generations and cultures. So Illuminated Recipes is one of countless survivance projects and texts that attest to the endurance and the defiant joy of refugee peoples. This was created by first-generation Vietnamese Americans. The contributors are children of immigrants and refugees, and together they're acknowledging the grief, the strangeness, the fear, and other obstacles that they and their family have encountered. But these these negative experiences are largely secondary to the pervasive love and promise of preservation that runs throughout this project. The collection of recipes is a salvage project that seeks to preserve not only the participants' cultural recipes, but also the complex nostalgia that's associated with family meals and the stories of their diverse families, and in some cases, even a loved one's handwriting appears. And so this collaborative project is a practical cookbook. You could easily follow these recipes in your kitchen. I'm tempted to do so myself one of these days. But it's also a celebration of Vietnamese diaspora, of tradition, of family, and it helps to serve as sort of a unique form of archive for both individual and collective narratives. This is capturing the history of those who are participating in this project. And many of those who participate in the project express that the recipes being shared are ones that are very significant to their family. They're recipes that create warm hearts or full stomachs, and they're oftentimes associated with good memories of togetherness, comfort, love, and empowerment. And so the recipes that are listed are more than just instructions for cooking. Instead, they're operating as instructions for navigating cultural identity, familial perseverance, and for evoking joy even in the face of life's difficulties. Like many refugee narratives, Illuminated Recipes employs alternative methods of storytelling and reading. It's a collection of deeply personal experiences that create a collective archive that is practical, cultural, and familial. Its mixed media format showcases a collection of recipes, poetry, personal stories, photography, artwork. If you name it, this piece has it within it. And what this does is they help to capture the messiness of memory work, because memory work is so messy, while also conveying the complex and real-world relationality that directly defies stereotypes of victimhood or of what a refugee experience is like. And when I say that, I mean the metaphor, it's a refugee experience. And so Illuminated Recipes not only a word that brings connection across generations and helps Vietnamese Americans feel less alone and more confident, but it's also a text that embodies survival and narrative resistance by dedicating itself to celebrating a continuance of stories and of traditions. So, to wrap up today, in this short time together, I've used Dictee, Palimpsest for Generation 1.5, and Illuminated Recipes as a sampling of refugee literary and creative works to demonstrate a range of possibilities for how this field is operating in terms of memory work, in terms of political critique, in terms of resistance, as well as an alternative form of archive for refugees, individuals, and communities. Granted, this is a topic that I think you could build an entire semester around. So again, this is a very brief overview of it. But in closing, though, I did want to sort of turn our attention back to sort of what is our current reality that we're operating in, and that is that the number of refugees in the world continues to grow every day. And when I first began this project that this lecture is coming out of, I began it back in 2019, and at the time there were an estimated 25.9 million refugees in the world and 70.8 million displaced people. Well, 5 years later, in 2024, those numbers have risen to 37.9 million refugees and 122.6 million displaced people. And they're likely only going to continue to increase due to ongoing conflicts, climate and financial crises, and of course, the Ukraine and Russian war and the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza. So by no means am I arguing that literature can solve this decades-old humanitarian crisis. Instead, what I hope that you took away from this was how literature can offer alternative representations of refugee realities that provide more honest and dynamic accounts than what we often are offered through the media, through politics, or even through academic studies that are sometimes based in the numbers and the facts more so than maybe in the people. And so while refugee experiences remain ultimately unknowable to readers, that doesn't mean that we have to stop making efforts to learn about them. Instead, in order for drastic change to occur, we need to continue making conscious space for refugee presence and voice, both textually and across the wider world. And so this is the question that I leave you with, is how can we continue to do so? What are ways that we can support this effort? So thank you so much for your time today. I do appreciate it, and I'm excited to engage in conversation with you and answer some of your questions.
Thank you for sticking to the time. Appreciate it. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
just making myself bigger. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. And for the class, remember that a couple of just a background. In the class, we talked a couple of regarding what exactly is the problem with finding narratives of refugees. Okay. We discussed also like many of the data or the ideas of refugees that we found out are not actually from the mouth of the refugees themselves, but rather than as a secondary data collection point.
Mhm.
Also remember that for your final paper, the prompt is exactly to find a way to see how you can use the knowledge that you gathered from this course and finding an angle that ties to your major. The cookbook itself is a particularly good example before we take the question regarding how you can demonstrate multimodality and use different thinking or mode into creating something that not only appeals to as an academic project, but also act as a, for a lack of a better word, product for the greater audience as well, because that exists. And after Dr. Pishotti has sent me that, I tried to find whether we can find in Hartford specifically, we have similar initiatives, especially from the Polish community and the Bosnian community, that look into collecting oral history, especially recipes. Food is essentially a part of creating or curating heritage, because most of your uh, reflection also touched on that you appreciated how the narratives told what particular food means to particular group of people. It is family, memory, connection, and all that. Now, for Dr. Peshuti, I will read out a couple of comments that our class has given for you, and also question that is coming both from the class itself, from the students, and also from the chat, and that I got from somewhere else. Due to the lack of time, I'll be combining a couple of questions and
Okay.
throw it out. You ended with what we can do more, and that is the part of almost three questions. I'm going to read it out for you. One, how do cultural aspects, and this is coming from our student Mikolai, how do cultural aspects such as cooking and meals, as well as personal experience, strengthen community, but also add new perspective about refugees and invite the idea of new conclusion and aspect of not thought or before? And this ties with another question uh, that I'm going to say. This is from SR. Is how do personal stories shared in Illuminated recipes challenges or broaden the typical mainstream understanding of American identity? And I think that connects nicely with regarding where does Vietnamese community stand here? What does it do for the refugee identity, do for finding a new interpretation for the American identity per se? What would be your thoughts on that?
No, those are great questions, and I understand why you're asking them in tandem with one another. Um, I think to answer the first part of it, as I think text like a cookbook, for example, is such a powerful representation of refugee works, pushing readers to sort of think about identity, to transcend like refugee positionality and connect with it, because things like food, like dance, like family traditions, those are areas of commonality that most of us have or understand. And I think for a lot of this that I've chatted about today is that point of commonality is how a lot of these connections or these resonances that I've talked about take place. Is there's this emphasis, or I talked so much about the emphasis on the physicality of language, of using a voice, of using breath, because that's a form of commonality that, for example, Cha and Ali are leaning into, saying, hey, we all have throats that is making this. And so while you can't understand what it's like to sit in a classroom and be told I'm not allowed to use my language, you have to use this language. We can understand like what it feels like to put to words. And I think the cookbook, Illuminated Recipes, is doing something similar, but almost in a more fun way, because food and recipes and making food with people of our same culture is something that I think is a common experience we can all identify with. And so we can sort of relate to it in that we see in the cookbook, a lot of times these are teens there's some children that are contributing to it. And I think it brings us back to times when we've shared recipes or shared cooking experiences with our own families. And so I think that ground of commonality is why it's so important to helping to introduce people to this reality of, oh, this is something I recognize and can understand. But in terms of the second part of that question as to how do personal stories challenge us to think about American identity, I mean, I think that's the drive and like what's so wonderful about like when we talk about like multi-ethnic literature, but like specifically refugee literature here, is that is it makes us again get into the head of the person that we're reading about. It helps us to connect with them on a level that we can't connect with people on the news necessarily, or in even a TikTok video nowadays, because instead we get into the headspace of these characters. Or when we're reading the recipes and Illuminated recipes, we're hearing about like actual family members and the things that they've endured and seeing what the result of that has been. And I think that's really great that even though I consider this a refugee text, a lot of the writers are sort of first generation immigrants, because then that adds a lot of layers to identity of how you can be a refugee and an immigrant at the same time, and like what that entails and how that folds into a person's sense of being an American and how that results itself. So that's such a great question. That's a question that's like a whole semester's worth of answering.
No, that's true. And I think you have hit the nail on the head on that, especially since you ended with the refugee, how somebody can be both immigrant and refugee. As an almost immigrant myself, that is always a challenge regarding, even though I'm talking in English or something, I could relate on a personal level with the Dictee regarding how language, with the utterances and different dynamic of it in the short form. And as far the identity goes, you ended on a point regarding how it does for our multi-ethnic identity that we kind of value in the United States. Two other questions from our students that also tied together. And I particularly appreciate you mentioning TikTok. These questions two of these coming from Brittany and Tram. I'll read this out again. How can these stories shared through food receive extensive attention as current media of refugeehood? Are these stories similar to the stories told through art and books? And which would be more efficient to catch the attention of the general public? And this ties with the question of Tram. What kinds of circumstances or even facts should refugees be aware of in order to prevent false assumption from anyone who wishes to harm them in any way? And this is going on, since you have shown that statistics regarding how the number of refugees have grown in the last 5 years, exponential, even though the wars is going on. So there's a lot of disinformation going on. In our class, we particularly focused on in one regarding, even though the Vietnamese refugees gather or gain highlight in the US society, it kind of overshadows the treatment of the Northerners and Southerners in literature. There was a particular recipe in the cookbook, and I think one of our students mentioned that, yes, Brittany does that. A especially moving story was the one of fried tofu in tomato sauce, when it mentioned, despite being at the top of his class, my father could not get into a university for being a Southerner in the 1970s. So I guess the question would be, what does this story or these stories do into making sure that the refugee experience gains a more broader acknowledgement in all their nuances, rather than some stereotypical information or identity that is tied up with different refugee group, be it Syrian, Vietnamese, or even in currently Palestinian?
I think that, I mean, that's sort of what I've been trying to do here today, is like the focus is to talk about, I mean, what do these stories do? How are they functioning? How do they resonate with us when we encounter them? And what is the power of that encounter? As I want to stress is, I'm not going to say that literature is going to solve the rhetoric or the hate that necessarily is generated right now around how we view, by we I mean like sort of larger cultural zeitgeist, how it's viewing refugees and specifically migrants at this point in time. But instead, what I think it offers is it brings us to a moment of humanity, right? That's what storytelling is about. Is it connects us to sort of, this is a person that is telling this story about themselves. And as another person, I can connect and relate to them. It brings us to sort of a one-on-one perspective, as opposed to sort of like this larger universal statistic driven perspective. It gives a person a face, it gives a person a background with personality, in a way that a lot of times can get erased. And so I like to think that what story, what literature, what art does is that it reminds people of the humanity behind this, what we label refugee, who we label immigrant, who we label migrant. Is I think it makes us confront the humanity when we encounter something like this, and it makes it, if you're actually reading it, engaging with it, it makes it incredibly difficult to deny that humanity. Because again, as when we're on a person-to-person basis, we're forced to think about like what are the connections that we can resonate between each other. And relating to the question at the top of this, which was about how to receive like extensive attention to this, what's like the role that maybe social media plays into this? I think that might be what the question was getting. Is I think on one hand, it can be really great. I think TikTok can be really great for providing stories like this, especially if it's used in like a creative way, sort of like this Illuminated recipes. If you create like a series of videos that are about championing this aspect, I think when it becomes something that's ineffective is again when it's just kind of being consumed along with everything else. I think you have to be very intentional about what stories you're choosing to listen to, and also thinking about who they're coming from, because that's also really important. Is it's I think easy for people to hop on and start talking about the refugee experience, but have no firsthand experience themselves. Instead, they're talking about it from, as we looked at earlier, maybe like a Fasan's, like the humanitarianism lens as opposed to like the personal lens. So it's messy. It's messy, and there's no straight answer. But I think continuing to be creative about it is a really powerful way of helping to create understanding and empathy.
Well, that is so true, and which brings us to kind of the last portion of the question. This is coming from, this appeared question at play on the 3 different questions from the class, and also from 8 different people from the chat.
Oh,
okay. So I'll just summarize, and it asks about the nature of protest. So the initial question from our class, which is from Tim, he pointed to a particular recipe which is about the rice porridge, and in the cookbook I saw it too, that one of the narrative I found particularly interesting, which didn't follow that symbolism, was the one about rice porridge and the goal of it being to overcook the rice to the point of being ruined, so to speak. Okay. And quote, relishing the expectation you set for yourself, celebrate yourself for not becoming the lucrative prodigy you are supposed to be. I dare you to follow your hopes and dreams, to explore your passion and desire. Unlike most recipes, the goal is not to achieve fluffy, large grain of rice that you can individually pick up with chopstick or tease with a fork. No, here you must fail. It seems impossible at first, but sooner or later failure is inevitable. This dish seems to me like a protest, and the question is, can putting food into mouth or in the similar advent be, sorry, it just went, can be a sign of protest? And some of the question from the chat was also, can literature, can any kind of activity that might seem just writing in like the Dictee in short form utterances, intentionally going in a different direction with a recipe, or intentionally doing something differently like the art performance that you've showed, can be considered as protest? And what does protest do for refugees in particular?
so I'm going to try to be very quick about this because I see we're getting to time.
Yeah.
But absolutely, I think first, to start with food, I absolutely agree it's a form of protest. I think the idea too of this cookbook existing and it being focused on food is this idea of nourishment, and how a lot of times we think about the refugee experience as lack of. And this is a form, by focusing on food, it's this idea of, no, we nourish our families, we are nourishing our our sense of cultural identity and making it stronger despite our conditions trying to get rid of it. And I think Dictee does exactly the same thing. I think Cha even describes it as a work of protest, where she's talking about just the choice to pick up a pen, to write down her experience, and to create something out of something that has been completely whittled away, is a form of survival. It's a form of ensuring a history gets passed on despite all forces working against it to eliminate it. And I think that's what writing does in general, whether it's for a wide audience, whether it's for yourself and your family, whether it's for only a room of like 3 or 4 people. I think by putting to words, or not just writing, any type of creative act, I think by putting to words or putting to creation a thing that declares, I am here, this is who I am, despite everything around me saying otherwise, that is a form of resistance. It's a form of survival. And that's, again, why I think Survivance is such an apt lens for refugee works, because that's what concept is all about.
Okay. I think that is a good point to stop. But thank you so much for joining and give us such an illuminating talk. You are getting a couple of claps, both on online and in class. Okay. And it was a fantastic presentation. I enjoyed it. I hope all of you enjoyed it too, especially how language and literature works, especially regarding imagination. But with that, Miss Pishotti, are you there?
I am, yes.
Okay. All right. Anyway, thank you for joining. We'll close this session. All right. I hope you have a very wonderful weekend with everything.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. And again, if there are any follow-up questions, feel free to share them.
Yeah, we just lost your video, so I was wondering whether you're in there or not. But yeah.
All right. There we go. Okay. I think I'm back. Thank you all so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to connect with any of you. And yeah, have a wonderful afternoon.
Okay. Have a wonderful too. Goodbye.